The night my husband walked out on me, he didn't even close the door properly. It swung halfway on its hinge, tapping against the wall like it was applauding him for leaving. And I stood there, barefoot on cold marble floors, listening to him tell me I would never understand ambition. He said I was small, ordinary, replaceable. Then he got into a car I didn't recognize, a car that belonged to his boss, the woman he said I shouldn't worry about, the woman he left me for. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I owned her company. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one who had been underestimated by the person who claimed to love me. So many of you said they thought I was nothing until they found out the truth. This is mine. 3 years earlier, my husband Daniel used to look at me like he was my entire world. We met at a charity tech fundraiser in London. I was there representing a family trust. That's what my lawyers advised me to say. Never mention ownership, never mention control. Stay invisible. Daniel was charismatic, confident. He had that kind of ambition that makes you believe you're standing next to the future. He talked about startups, scaling, venture capital. I listened. I admired him. I loved how alive he looked when he described success. But he never once asked what I did. Not really. He knew I consulted. He knew I had investments, but I kept it vague on purpose. My father taught me something when he handed over majority shares of our global tech corporation at 30. Power is safest when no one knows you have it. So, when Daniel proposed after 10 months, I signed a prenuptial agreement that protected everything, quietly, carefully. My legal team structured everything through holding entities, even the company he would eventually work for. He thought he was building his own success story. He didn't know he was already working inside mine. The company's name was Viridian Global Technologies. Publicly, it was run by CEO Isabel Laurent. Brilliant, sharp, ruthless in the boardroom. She was the face. I was the majority shareholder. Silent, invisible. Final vote on everything. Daniel didn't even know I attended board meetings via encrypted video under a neutral screen name. He didn't know I approved budgets. He didn't know his promotion from regional strategist to executive director required my signature. He thought Isabel saw his potential. In truth, I did, and I approved it because I was proud of him, because I loved him, because I believed marriage meant lifting each other higher. The shift started subtly. Late nights became later, business trips became more frequent. His tone changed. He began correcting me when I spoke about market trends, ironically, trends I'd predicted before his own department reported them. One night, over dinner, he said, "You wouldn't understand corporate pressure. You've never really had to earn anything." It was the first time I felt something fracture inside me. I had earned everything, but invisibility has a price, and I had chosen it. Then came Isabel. He mentioned her casually at first. She's intense but brilliant. She works harder than anyone I've ever seen. She built herself from nothing. His admiration in his voice sharpened over time. I knew Isabel well. I hired her 5 years ago after acquiring her failing startup. I respected her drive, but I also knew her patterns. She aligned herself with rising executives, mentored them, elevated them, and sometimes entangled them. I told myself I was being paranoid. Powerful women are always accused unfairly. I refused to be that wife. Until the night I saw the message flash across Daniel's phone. Dinner ran late. Stay over. No one needs to know. He didn't see me read it, but I saw everything. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did what I always do. I gathered information. Boardroom access logs, corporate apartment usage records, security footage timestamps. And what I found wasn't just an affair. It was strategic. Isabel had begun positioning Daniel for a future C-suite role, grooming him publicly, linking his brand to hers in media interviews. Investors were starting to mention them together. Power couple, visionary duo. My husband was becoming her successor, using my company, my capital, my infrastructure, and he didn't even know it was mine. The confrontation finally happened on a rain-soaked Thursday. He came home smelling like her perfume. I asked him one question, calmly. "Are you in love with her?" He didn't deny it. He didn't even hesitate. He said, "She understands the world I'm trying to build. She's not small." Small. That word again. I asked him if he was leaving, and he said yes. He said Isabel had offered him more than I ever could. More power, more status, more relevance. I almost laughed, but instead I simply nodded, and I let him walk out. Because sometimes the only way to expose arrogance is to let it believe it has won. And as the door tapped against the wall behind him, I picked up my phone and scheduled an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. They thought I was invisible. They were about to learn I was inevitable. Monday morning arrived with a kind of stillness that only comes before impact. The boardroom at Viridian Global Technologies overlooked the London skyline. Glass walls, polished walnut table, screens embedded into the surface like silent witnesses. Isabel was already there when I arrived. She didn't know I was coming in person. Very few people had ever seen me step into that room physically. I preferred encrypted calls, controlled lighting, controlled angles, power from a distance. But today required presence. Her eyes flicked up when the door opened, just a polite glance at first, then confusion, then calculation. Daniel was seated 2 chairs down from her. He didn't look at me immediately. He was reviewing briefing documents, the ones I had personally revised at 3 a.m. I took the head seat, the only seat with final authority. And I said nothing. There is something profoundly destabilizing about silence when someone expects you to speak from the margins. The board members began to shift in their chairs. One cleared his throat. Another leaned toward Isabel and whispered something I couldn't hear. Daniel finally looked up. He smiled faintly, confused, almost amused. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Not hostile, just dismissive, as if I had wandered into the wrong meeting. I folded my hands on the table. "I called this meeting," I said. The room froze. Isabel's expression didn't change, but her posture did. Straighter, alert. Daniel laughed softly. Very funny. No one else laughed. Because they knew. They had always known. I pressed a single button embedded in the table. The primary display screen lit up behind me. Legal ownership charts, share distribution breakdowns, voting power ratios. My name, clearly printed at the top. Majority shareholder, 62%. Controlling interest. Final executive authority. Daniel's face drained of color so quickly I thought he might faint. Isabel didn't blink, but her fingers tightened around her pen. "You're joking," he whispered. I tilted my head slightly. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The oldest board member, Mr. Carlyle, cleared his throat. "For clarity, Miss—" I didn't let him finish. "Mrs. Bennet," I corrected calmly. "For now." Daniel inhaled sharply at the surname, the same surname he had just abandoned days earlier. I stood, walked slowly along the edge of the table. I acquired Viridian 5 years ago through Helix Holdings. I appointed Isabel as CEO. I approved every executive hire, every capital raise, every expansion into Berlin and San Francisco. I stopped directly behind Daniel's chair. "And I personally signed off on your promotion, Daniel." He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Isabel finally spoke. Her voice was controlled, precise. "You concealed a conflict of interest." I smiled faintly. "No,
protected my privacy. You allowed your husband to work under my leadership without disclosure. And you allowed yourself to sleep with a married executive, I replied evenly. The air left the room. No one moved. Daniel pushed his chair back abruptly. You're trying to humiliate us. I walked back to my seat and sat down. No, I said. If I were trying to humiliate you, this meeting would be live-streamed. His jaw tightened. Isabel's gaze sharpened. What do you want? Now that was the right question. I tapped the screen again. Financial irregularities appeared. Expense allocations routed through discretionary accounts. Corporate apartment usage flagged under strategic housing. Daniel's access ID, Isabel's authorization stamp. Corporate resources used for personal activities, I said calmly. Violation of Executive Conduct Clause 4.3 and 7.2. Daniel looked at Isabel in panic. She remained still. This is standard executive privilege. Not when the majority owner is reviewing it personally, I replied. Silence. Then I delivered the first blow. Daniel Bennett, effective immediately, you are suspended pending internal investigation. He stared at me as if I had struck him physically. You can't do that. I just did. He stood up fully now, anger replacing shock. You set me up, he hissed. I met his eyes, finally, directly. No, I said softly. You underestimated me. And that hurt him more than the suspension. Isabel leaned forward. If you remove him publicly, investor confidence will destabilize. The press already sees him as my successor. I nodded. Yes, they do. I let that linger. And that, I continued, is precisely why this must be handled carefully. I turned to the board. I am initiating a leadership audit effective today. Isabel, you will retain your title during review. However, all executive privileges are frozen. Her expression flickered for the first time, just slightly. You're threatening the stability of your own company, she said. I shook my head slowly. I am protecting it. Daniel looked between us, desperation creeping in. You're doing this because I left. I almost felt sorry for him, almost. No, I replied quietly. I'm doing this because you thought you were leaving someone powerless. The truth is, I would have let him go peacefully if he had been honest, if he had simply said he fell out of love. But he chose arrogance. He chose betrayal layered with contempt. And contempt is expensive. The meeting ended without shouting, without theatrics. That's the thing about real power. It doesn't need to yell. Daniel was escorted out discreetly. Isabel remained seated long after everyone else left. When we were alone, she finally asked, Why hide? I looked out at the skyline. Because when people know you own the board, they stop showing you who they really are. She studied me carefully. You're not done, she said. No, I wasn't. Because suspending Daniel was only the beginning. What he didn't know, what Isabel didn't know, was that the audit I initiated would uncover something far more explosive than an affair. And when it did, there would be no coming back.
The audit began quietly. That was intentional. In corporate warfare, noise gives your opponent time to prepare. Silence gives you access. By Tuesday afternoon, my forensic accounting team was already inside Viridian's internal systems. Not the surface-level dashboards executives like Daniel played with. I'm talking about raw back-end data, unfiltered expense trails, shadow contracts, subsidiary transfers routed through European shells. The kind of places people assume no one important ever looks. They forget who built the system. Daniel tried calling me 11 times that day. I didn't answer. He left voicemails that moved through all 5 stages of ego collapse. First, disbelief, then anger, then negotiation, then blame, then something that almost sounded like fear. You're destroying my career over a relationship problem. No, Daniel, you destroyed your career the moment you confused proximity to power with ownership of it. By Wednesday, the auditors found the first irregularity that didn't involve hotel suites or private flights. A capital allocation fund, 48 million euros, earmarked for a Berlin expansion, had been partially redirected. Not stolen, repositioned, into a side venture quietly registered under an investment group connected to Isabel. The documentation was elegant, clean, legally gray, the kind of move that would go unnoticed unless someone with majority override permissions requested a deep structural trace, which I had. Isabel hadn't just been mentoring Daniel. She had been building something parallel, something off the books. And Daniel was listed as strategic co-director. When I saw his digital signature attached to the authorization memo, I felt something colder than anger. It wasn't the money.
$48 million was recoverable. It was the intention. He hadn't just fallen in love. He had planned a future that excluded me, professionally and personally, using the infrastructure of my empire to launch his own. With her. I called an emergency executive session for Friday. This time, Daniel wouldn't be invited, but Isabel would be. That evening, Daniel showed up at the house. Not our house, my house. The property had been transferred to my private trust long before we married, another detail he had never cared enough to ask about. He looked exhausted, tie loose, eyes red. "You froze my accounts," he said the moment I opened the door. "I froze your corporate access," I corrected. "My bonuses are tied to those shares." "Those conditional shares," I said calmly, "that never fully vested." He stared at me like he was trying to reassemble the woman he thought he knew. "You lied to me." I let that hang between us. "No," I said quietly. "I just didn't announce myself." He stepped inside without being invited. That used to bother me. Now it just felt symbolic. "You humiliated me in that boardroom. You humiliated me in my marriage." His jaw tightened. "This isn't the same." "You're right," I said. "It isn't. Because what he did was betrayal. What I was doing was correction." He ran a hand through his hair. "Isabel says you're overreacting, that this audit is aggressive. Investors are asking questions." "Good," I replied. He looked stunned. "You don't care if stock drops?" I smiled faintly. "Daniel, I've weathered market crashes you've only read about in textbooks." I stepped closer. Not intimate, just direct. "You thought she built that company from nothing?" He didn't answer. "I built the platform she stands on." For a second, just a flicker, I saw doubt enter his expression. "Isabel wouldn't risk illegal exposure," he said quietly. "Not illegal," I replied, "just disloyal." And that word hit differently, because in business, disloyalty spreads faster than scandal. Friday arrived with storm clouds hanging low over the city. Isabel entered the executive chamber alone this time. No assistants, no legal team. That told me two things. One, she believed she could talk her way out. Two, she wasn't fully sure what I had found. I let her sit. Then I projected the Berlin fund transfer on the wall. She didn't react immediately. That's what makes her dangerous. She calculates before emotion. "It's a strategic diversification vehicle," she said. "Daniel and I were preparing an acquisition target that would ultimately benefit Viridian. Without board approval? It would have come later." I studied her carefully. "And when were you planning to disclose that you personally held equity in the vehicle?" Her silence lasted 2 seconds too long. She leaned back slowly. "You're making this personal." I tilted my head. "You made it personal. You're punishing me because he chose me." I almost laughed. "No," I said softly. "I'm removing you because you chose yourself over the company." That was the truth. If this had been only about Daniel, I would have walked away. Divorce, settlement, closure. But this was governance. And governance doesn't tolerate shadow empires. I placed a folder in front of her. Inside were 2 documents. One, formal resignation papers with negotiated exit terms, generous, quiet, reputation protected. 2, immediate termination proceedings with public disclosure of fiduciary breach. She didn't open either right away. "You're ruthless," she said. I met her gaze steadily. "No," I replied. "I'm responsible." She finally opened the folder, read carefully. "You'd remove me entirely?" "Yes." "And Daniel?" "He's already removed himself." The room felt heavier, not tense, decisive. Isabel closed the folder slowly. "You think this ends clean?" she asked. "I know it does," I replied, because I had already anticipated her next move. What she didn't know was that one of her closest executive allies had agreed to testify internally in exchange for immunity. And that testimony didn't just implicate Berlin funds. It implicated offshore transfers far larger than $48 million. Transfers Daniel had personally reviewed. Transfers that, once exposed, would make suspension look merciful. Isabel stood. "If you do this," she said quietly, "you destroy him." I didn't flinch. He chose the battlefield. She signed the resignation. Clean, immediate, effective at market close. By 4:01 p.m., Viridian Global Technologies had a new interim CEO. Me. Publicly. No more invisibility. No more shadows. Daniel found out from the press alert. And when his name began trending alongside phrases like executive misconduct investigation, that's when he realized this wasn't about a broken marriage. It was about a broken illusion. And the illusion was collapsing faster than he could control it. But the real explosion hadn't happened yet, because the offshore transfers tied to his authorization were about to trigger something neither of them saw coming. Something that wouldn't just end careers, it would invite prosecutors.
The call from legal came at 6:12 a.m. I was already awake. I hadn't slept much since Monday. Not because I was anxious, but because momentum requires precision, and precision requires presence. Offshore confirmations came in overnight, my general counsel said. His voice was calm but clipped. The transfers weren't just advisory holds, they were structured redirections. How much? I asked. A pause. 212 million euros. I closed my eyes briefly. That wasn't opportunistic. That was architectural. The funds had been routed through layered holding companies in Luxembourg and Cyprus, perfectly legal entities, until intent shifts from diversification to concealment. And intent was written all over the metadata. Digital approvals, encrypted memos, authorization timestamps aligning with Daniel's executive clearance. He hadn't wired the money himself, but he had opened the gate. By 8 a.m., my crisis management team was in motion. Not to hide it, to control the order of exposure. There's a difference. If regulators discover misconduct before you do, you look negligent. If you discover it first and self-report, you look accountable. So at 9:15 a.m., I made the decision. We would notify authorities voluntarily. Daniel showed up at corporate headquarters before noon. Security didn't stop him. I had given instructions not to. He stormed into my office without knocking. His face was pale, not angry this time, terrified. "What did you do?" he demanded. I was standing by the window overlooking the city. Interim CEO. My name freshly engraved on the glass door behind him. "I protected the company," I said calmly. "You reported it?" "Yes." His breath hitched. "You could have handled it internally." "No," I corrected. "You could have." He ran both hands through his hair. "This isn't fraud. It was strategic capital positioning. For an entity partially owned by Isabel," I replied. "It would have been disclosed." "When?" He didn't answer. Because disclosure after profit isn't transparency, it's damage control. "You're ruining me," he whispered. I turned to face him fully. "No, Daniel," I said softly. "I'm revealing you. And there's a difference." He stepped closer, desperation bleeding through the cracks of his confidence. "You think they'll spare you? The press will tear this company apart. They'll drag your name through it." "I can survive scrutiny," I replied. "Can you?" That's when the weight of it finally settled on him. The interviews, the forensic audits, the potential charges. He had gambled on invisibility, and invisibility had expired. By late afternoon, financial media picked up the internal investigation statement. Verity and Global Technologies announces voluntary compliance review. The language was careful, clinical, but speculation moves faster than official wording. Within hours, commentators began dissecting executive leadership. Daniel's name surfaced repeatedly, so did Isabel's sudden resignation. My name, however, dominated the headlines. Majority shareholder steps in as CEO amid executive scandal. No more hidden ownership. No more anonymity. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I protected my identity to avoid manipulation, and in 1 week, betrayal forced me into the spotlight anyway. That night, Daniel called again. This time, I answered. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "They're freezing my personal accounts pending review." "I know. You knew this would happen." "Yes." His breathing was even. "You trusted me." I let that settle in silence. "You trusted me to stay small," I replied quietly. There was a long pause. Then, for the first time since all this began, his voice cracked. "I didn't think you'd go this far." I closed my eyes briefly. "I didn't think you either." 2 days later, regulators arrived at Veridian's headquarters. Formal, controlled. No dramatic raids, just subpoenas and sealed requests for documentation. The board backed me unanimously. They had no choice. Transparency was now survival. Isabel retained high-profile legal counsel immediately. Daniel tried to do the same, but elite defense firms require liquidity, and liquidity was currently inaccessible. He came to the house again that weekend, but this time he didn't walk in. He knocked. I opened the door slowly. He looked smaller somehow, the arrogance stripped away, leaving something fragile underneath. "Can we talk?" he asked. I considered closing the door. Instead, I stepped aside. We sat across from each other in the living room that used to hold laughter. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. That sentence, the universal refuge of people who absolutely did. "You meant to win," I replied. He flinched. "You made me feel insignificant." The audacity almost impressed me. "You felt insignificant," I corrected, "because you needed to feel superior." He looked down at his hands. "Isabel believed in me." "So did I said. "But you didn't need me." There it was. The real fracture. He didn't leave because I was small. He left because I wasn't.
I needed to build something of my own, he continued. Something not connected to you. You were, I said calmly. You just didn't know it. And that was the tragedy. He thought success meant stepping out of my shadow, when in reality, he was standing inside my light the entire time. A notification buzzed on my phone mid-conversation. Breaking news alert. Veridian Global Technologies announces voluntary compliance review into offshore tech investment vehicles linked to former Veridian executives. Former. Past tense. Daniel saw it too, and in that moment, I watched him realize something irreversible. This wasn't just about fines. If intent was proven, criminal charges were possible. He stood abruptly. You could still help me. I didn't respond immediately. You have influence, he pressed. You could shape the narrative, clarify my role, say I wasn't fully aware. That's when I felt it. The final snap of whatever thread remained between us. You were aware, I said evenly. You reviewed the transfers. I trusted Isabel, and I trusted you. Silence swallowed the room. Please, he whispered. That word felt heavier than all his previous accusations. For a moment, just a moment, I remembered the man I married, the laughter, the shared dreams. But memory does not erase consequence. I won't lie for you, I said softly. He stared at me like I had sentenced him myself. Maybe in his mind I had. But the truth is, I didn't design his decisions. I only refused to cushion their landing. After he left, I stood by the window again. London's skyline glittered under the night sky, indifferent to personal catastrophe. My phone rang once more. This time, it wasn't Daniel. It was my legal counsel. They've requested Daniel's testimony, and Isabel's. I inhaled slowly. Voluntary? I asked. No. A warrant was being prepared. I ended the call and stared at the city lights. The man who left me for power was about to understand what power actually costs. And the woman who thought she could build a shadow empire inside mine was about to discover that shadows disappear when the real owner steps into the sun. But what neither of them knew yet was that during the audit, something else surfaced. Something older. Something dating back before Berlin. Before Isabel. Before even our marriage. And when that file finished decrypting, it wouldn't just threaten Daniel's future. It would rewrite his past.
The file finished decrypting at 2:43 a.m. I was alone in my office at headquarters, heels off, city lights dim behind the glass. My head of cybersecurity had stayed with me, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen like it was dragging history behind it. When it opened, it didn't look dramatic. No red warnings, no flashing alerts. Just archived correspondence, time-stamped 4 years ago, before Berlin, before Isabel, before our wedding, before everything. Where did this originate? I asked quietly. Legacy server, my cybersecurity lead replied. It was buried in an acquisition data transfer, encrypted under restricted executive clearance. Executive clearance that, at the time, only one rising strategist had been granted early access to. Daniel. The emails were between him and a private equity intermediary firm I recognized immediately, a firm known for hostile positioning tactics. The subject lines were sterile: exploratory synergy models, equity entry points, control threshold analysis. But the content told a different story. Daniel had been inquiring, years ago, about how to acquire incremental voting power in Veridian through secondary market purchases. Small blocks, quiet accumulation. He had been researching how to reach influence thresholds without triggering public disclosure. 4 years ago, before he even proposed to me, I felt something colder than betrayal. Premeditation. There were follow-up messages, too. He had asked about marriage laws in relation to asset consolidation, about spousal equity exposure in private holdings, about trust structures. He hadn't known my name was already attached to 62. Cooperation. It sounds noble when lawyers say it, strategic when prosecutors suggest it, but what it really means is deciding who you're willing to burn to save yourself. Daniel requested a meeting through his attorney 3 days after the charges were announced, not with prosecutors, with me. That told me everything. We met in a private legal conference room, not my house, not the office, neutral ground, cameras outside, reporters already speculating about possible reconciliation because the public will always prefer romance over reality. He looked older, not physically aged, but stripped, like someone who had been sanded down by consequence. "I'm considering cooperating," he said immediately. No small talk. I studied him carefully. "With prosecutors?" "Yes." "And why are you telling me?" He hesitated. "Because if I do, this won't stay contained to Isabel." There it was, the bigger shadow. Over the past week, my own legal team had begun mapping Daniel's communications beyond Viridian. Patterns were emerging, connections to venture coalitions, aggressive acquisition groups, and two politically exposed investors known for leveraging regulatory gray zones. People who funded disruption, then stepped back before fallout. Daniel had been in rooms I hadn't authorized, rooms that discussed accelerated market capture, using Viridian's expansion strategy as leverage to destabilize competitors. And if those conversations were documented, this wasn't just corporate misconduct, it was market manipulation territory. "Who else is involved?" I asked quietly. He looked down at the polished table. "There were back-channel discussions," he admitted. "Strategic advisory dinners, off-record projections." "Names?" He swallowed. "Two senior partners from Halbert Capital, one policy liaison in Brussels, and—" He stopped. "And?" "A board observer." My spine straightened slightly. "A Viridian board observer?" He nodded faintly. That changed the battlefield entirely. Board observers don't vote, but they influence, they advise. And if one of them had been feeding external entities information about internal growth strategies, then the corruption wasn't a branch, it was a root. "Who tell me now?" I asked. His voice cracked, not dramatically, just enough. "Because they're not protecting me." Of course they weren't. Powerful people rarely do. He leaned forward slightly. "If I cooperate, they'll retaliate, financially, legally, personally." "And you think I'll shield you?" "I think," he said slowly, "you still care whether I survive this." Silence stretched between us. Care is a complicated currency. "I won't obstruct justice," I said finally. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" His eyes met mine clearer than they had been in weeks. "Help me navigate it without being destroyed." Destroyed. That word again. He still believed consequence equaled annihilation. He still hadn't fully understood that exposure isn't destruction, it's revelation. "If you cooperate," I said carefully, "you tell the full truth, not edited, not curated." He nodded slowly. "And you accept whatever accountability follows." Another pause. Then, "Yes." I studied him for a long moment. This wasn't the man who had dismissed me as small. This was someone staring directly at collapse and realizing he couldn't outmaneuver it. "If you lie again," I said quietly, "I won't intervene." "I know." And for the first time since all this began, he sounded honest. That evening, I convened a confidential board subcommittee. Only 3 members, trusted, independent. I disclosed the possibility of broader external influence tied to the Berlin structuring and early equity positioning. Shock registered, anger too. But more than anything, relief. Because if corruption extended beyond Daniel and Isabel, then removing them wasn't the end of instability, it was the beginning of cleansing. 2 days later, Daniel formally signaled intent to cooperate with prosecutors. In exchange, he requested sentencing consideration. The media frenzy reignited instantly. Speculation shifted from scandal to conspiracy. Financial talk shows debated whether Viridian had been targeted strategically for hostile influence from within. And my name moved from betrayed spouse to reformist CEO dismantling internal corruption.
Halbrecht Capital publicly denied any misconduct. The Brussels policy liaison issued a brief statement distancing himself from private investment discussions. And the board observer? He resigned quietly within 48 hours. Guilt moves faster when light turns on. But retaliation came exactly as Daniel predicted. Anonymous opinion pieces began surfacing online, questioning my leadership, suggesting I orchestrated the exposure to consolidate power, implying emotional vendetta disguised as governance. Whispers, strategic, designed to destabilize investor trust. My crisis team traced digital origins, not illegal, not directly traceable, but patterned, coordinated. The message was clear. Back down. I didn't. Instead, I scheduled a live shareholder address, public, transparent, unscripted beyond financial disclosures. If they wanted narrative warfare, they'd get it in daylight. The day of the address, cameras filled the main conference hall. Investors streamed in virtually from 3 continents. I stood at the podium, not as a wife, not a victim, as majority owner and CEO. Viridian was built on innovation, but innovation without integrity is instability. I outlined the voluntary disclosure, the internal audit, the expanded review of governance structures. I did not mention Daniel emotionally. I mentioned accountability. And then I said something deliberate. No individual, regardless of title, relationship, or history, is above ethical scrutiny within this company. The message was precise. Stock rose 3% by market close. Integrity reassures more than silence ever could. That night, Daniel called again. They're offering a deal, he said quietly. I listened. Reduced sentencing exposure in exchange for full cooperation against external influence parties. And, I asked. I'm going to take it. There was no drama in his voice this time, just acceptance. I never meant it to become this, he said softly. I know, because ambition rarely begins as destruction. It begins as hunger, unexamined hunger. Do you hate me? The question lingered. No, I said truthfully, I don't. Hate requires emotional investment, and I had already withdrawn mine. After we ended the call, I stood alone in my office again. The skyline looked different now, not hostile, not triumphant, just steady. Daniel's cooperation would ignite a broader investigation. Powerful names would surface. Regulatory committees would scrutinize more than just Viridian, and some of those individuals would attempt countermeasures, legal, financial, political. The next phase wouldn't be personal. It would be systemic. But there was one more conversation I hadn't had yet. One person who had remained silent through all of this. My father. The man who taught me that power is safest when unseen, and who was now watching his daughter step directly into fire. He requested dinner. No lawyers, no advisors, just family. And something in his tone told me he knew more than he had ever shared.
The dinner with my father was quiet at first. A private room at his favorite London club, mahogany panels, dim amber lighting, the kind of place where whispers hold weight. No cameras, no press, just us. He poured me a glass of Cabernet and studied me over the rim. His eyes, the same piercing blue that had overseen boardrooms and board votes alike, didn't judge, they calculated. You're in deeper than you think, he said simply. I raised an eyebrow. I know exactly where I am. He chuckled, soft and dry. You think you do, but there are currents under the surface you can't see from the CEO's chair. I set my glass down. Then tell me. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder, one of those antique things that feels heavier than its contents. I've kept this for years, he said, for the day I thought you'd be ready. Inside were documents I hadn't seen before, contracts, equity statements, and most importantly, signed letters from investors. Investors I'd known by reputation but never personally interacted with. They outlined clauses for emergency intervention in the event of governance instability. Viridian had never been fully my company, he explained, but the power to act decisively had always been granted to the family trust. Even my father's signature carried a hidden authorization, an override that allowed me to act without board approval in critical scenarios. "You've had leverage the entire time," he said, his voice low. "It's just taken betrayal to make you realize it." I let the weight of it sink in. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the power realization. All this time, Daniel had been trying to outmaneuver me, thinking I was small, unaware that I held the keys to the kingdom he sought to conquer. The next day, Daniel's cooperation with prosecutors escalated. He provided evidence of Isabel's financial maneuvers, emails documenting premeditated equity positioning, and even conversations with the Brussels liaison. Each disclosure tightened the noose around executives who had believed themselves untouchable. But Daniel hadn't stopped at Isabel. During interrogations, a private equity partner named Klaus Reinhardt surfaced, an aggressive investor with ties to multiple tech conglomerates. His name wasn't publicly known yet, but within hours, investigators identified his role in creating shell companies and routing funds designed to destabilize Viridian's market position. I watched it all unfold from the command center I had set up in the office. Real-time reports, encrypted communications, stock market fluctuations, and media alerts streamed across 3 screens. Isabel, for her part, had fled to Paris. Her legal team was scrambling. She hadn't anticipated Daniel's early disclosure or my readiness. Daniel called again that night. "They're coming after you now," he said quietly. I leaned back, studying the skyline. Who? People connected to Klaus. They're using media narratives to spin this as a personal vendetta. I smiled faintly. Let them spin. The facts speak louder than opinion. He hesitated. "You're ruthless." "Not ruthless," I said calmly. "Precise, calculated, necessary." By the 3rd day, I realized something crucial. Daniel had underestimated me entirely, not just my ownership, but my network, my preparedness, my willingness to act decisively. His arrogance had blinded him to the fact that I wasn't reacting emotionally, I was executing strategically. Every press leak he anticipated, every media spin he had considered, every investor he thought he could manipulate had already been countered. The board, fully briefed, moved with the precision of a military unit. Regulators were preemptively guided by voluntary disclosures. Every journalist who called was provided accurate information before they could speculate. Daniel's panic calls increased. "They're filing injunctions. Haltbricht is questioning everything. I didn't see this coming." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reviewed the next step in the plan, the offshore audits. The audit revealed a chain of transfers beyond the Berlin Fund, hundreds of millions routed through Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, all linked directly to shell companies that Daniel had helped structure before even meeting Isabel. It was the final piece of the puzzle, proof that his ambition had been quietly building toward Viridian control years before he attempted to leave. This wasn't betrayal born of passion, it was betrayal engineered like a market strategy. The culmination came during the high-stakes board meeting that Friday. I presented the evidence to the assembled directors and legal team. Isabel's Paris-based counsel participated via encrypted video, looking increasingly defeated. "Board, we are not here to punish personal relationships. We are here to protect the integrity of the company." I displayed the documents showing Daniel's premeditated positioning, the offshore fund routing, and the investors implicated indirectly. Heads shook, gasps murmured through the room. Every senior executive understood the magnitude. This wasn't an affair. This was an orchestrated attempt to consolidate control using Viridian's assets. Daniel was present via video feed, pale and tense. He mouthed words I couldn't hear. I concluded, because of these findings, immediate compliance reporting will expand to all offshore and secondary market transactions, and as majority shareholder, I am exercising my authority to oversee every action until the investigation concludes. Silence. Then one of the directors, the most conservative member, spoke. Miss Bennett, this is decisive. You've acted thoroughly. Yes, I had. That night, after Daniel had been removed from access and Isabel's counsel conceded to regulatory oversight, I walked through the city alone. London glittered like a field of distant stars. Every street, every light, every shadow reminded me of the weeks prior. Deception, betrayal, the quiet arrogance of people who believe they can outmaneuver inevitability. Daniel had believed he could exploit proximity and ambition to claim what was never his. He hadn't realized that the woman he dismissed as small held the ultimate leverage, the knowledge, the authority, and the foresight to act with surgical precision. The final message came that evening from Daniel. I underestimated you completely. There's no coming back from this. I didn't reply immediately, because there was nothing to reply. He had learned what betrayal costs when met with preparation, and the company, the empire, the life I had built silently was untouchable in my hands. But even at the climax, I knew this was only the beginning, because exposing one pair of traitors only reveals the edges of the network. Other ambitious players, lurking in shadows, would now understand the stakes. Some would retreat, some would strike, and I was ready, not as a wife scorned, not as a betrayed partner, but as the rightful owner, fully visible, fully empowered, and fully prepared to ensure that anyone who underestimated me would regret it. The days after the climax moved with the relentless precision of a clock counting down in silence. Regulators, auditors, and compliance teams worked in tandem. Daniel had formally agreed to cooperate, providing full documentation and witness testimony. Isabel, cornered by her own misjudgments, began negotiating civil settlements. And through it all, I maintained visibility, not for vindication, not for revenge, for control. Because control is the true measure of power, not anger. I spent mornings reviewing forensic reports, afternoons with legal counsel, nights alone planning, every step deliberate, every message calculated, every public disclosure timed to maintain market stability. There was a strange serenity in it. The chaos outside, headlines, rumors, whispered speculation couldn't touch me. I had positioned myself beyond the reach of impulse. Daniel called again one evening. "I don't understand how you're still standing so calm," he admitted. I looked out over the London skyline. Lights shimmered across the Thames like distant stars. "I'm not standing, I'm advancing." He was silent for a moment. Then, "You're not the woman I knew." I allowed a small smile. "I never was. I was just hidden." The court proceedings began quietly. Daniel faced charges for willful facilitation of the concealed capital redirection. Isabel faced civil penalties for fiduciary breaches and regulatory infractions. Neither could claim ignorance. Evidence was too precise, too deliberate. But the company? Viridian remained stable. Investors saw a board taking responsibility, a CEO enforcing transparency, and a network of checks and balances that reassured them more than any charismatic spokesperson could. Power, I realized, doesn't roar. It stabilizes, it reassures, it persists. In the following weeks, my father called again. "You handled it," he said simply. "I did what had to be done," I replied. "More than that," he said, "you handled it as an owner, not a victim." That distinction weighed on me. Victimhood is easy. Ownership demands calculation, patience, and foresight. It demands you see people clearly, not who they pretend to be, not who they were when you loved them, but who they actually are. And Daniel had revealed himself fully. Ambition first, love only as cover. I requested a private meeting with the remaining board members. "Consider this the new governance charter," I told them. "No executive is above scrutiny. No financial maneuver is private if it threatens the company's stability. We operate openly, transparently, and ethically." They nodded, some nervously, some with relief. They understood that leadership isn't about fear, it's about clarity. I returned to my personal life slowly, not immediately, but methodically. Privacy reclaimed, boundaries rebuilt, the house, once filled with memories of betrayal, now felt like a neutral space. Neutrality is underrated. It allows for strategy, for calm, for reflection. I reflected on Daniel's final messages. He admitted under his breath in fragmented texts what he couldn't admit publicly. He had underestimated me at every turn. And that, I realized, is the core lesson. Underestimating someone's resolve is fatal, especially when the stakes are ambition, trust, and power. A month later, Daniel formally pleaded guilty to the charges brought against him in exchange for reduced sentencing. Isabel settled with the regulators. Her career effectively paused. Both had consequences, but neither was catastrophic. They were proportional. Justice had been meted not as revenge, but as inevitability. I stood in the boardroom alone one evening, reflecting on how differently things could have gone if I had not anticipated, observed, and acted decisively. The betrayal, while painful, had clarified everything. Who could be trusted? Who could not? What power truly looks like? I sent the final communication to all stakeholders. Viridian is stronger than rumors, stronger than deception, stronger than individual ambition. Our path forward is built on transparency, foresight, and integrity. The company will continue to innovate responsibly, and those who seek to exploit it will find the doors firmly closed. That email was short, precise, and final. Late that night, I walked through the quiet office, looking out at the skyline. The city was alive, indifferent to individual drama, but perfectly reflective of the lesson I had learned. Survival and success are reserved for those who act with awareness, patience, and courage. Daniel had left a trail, but I had transformed it into a roadmap for integrity. Isabel had sought shadow power, but exposure revealed the truth. And I had reclaimed authority, not with vengeance, but with clarity. The sense of triumph wasn't in seeing them falter, it was in seeing the system work as it should, in realigning consequences with action, and ensuring that betrayal met reality. I thought back to the moments of fear, anger, and disbelief. I had allowed myself to feel them, but never to act from them. That restraint, my secret weapon, had turned betrayal into leverage, deception into proof, and chaos into order. And as I finally sat back, the weight of weeks lifting from my shoulders, I understood the most important truth. Power is not about ownership alone. It is about understanding, anticipating, and acting decisively when the moment demands it. Betrayal can break people, but it can also reveal their true strength. I had been betrayed, and yet here I was, not small, not hidden, but fully visible, fully prepared, and fully in control. The city lights reflected in the glass like scattered fragments of possibility, and I knew without a doubt that no one who underestimated me would ever make the same mistake again.